You're now listening to Felix firing off from afar for the flyover, 11th installment. And in this installment, Felix is going to try to expound upon the major theme of discussion on Counterpower After Hours tonight, which is the extreme violence unleashed upon indigenous persons and also the resistance to that. And Felix is going to go ahead and try to highlight some themes that are very relevant to that subject of discussion, but also perhaps extend beyond it. And so he's going to refer first to the book Caliban and the Witch, which was mentioned before on Counterpower After Hours when Ray and Loon were on and spent quite a lot of time talking about how they inhabit their bodies, which was interesting. But in the book Caliban and the Witch, the author Sylvia Federici argues that women were systematically denigrated. That is, they were described as inherently inferior to men, wildly emotional and irrational, lusty, and unable to govern themselves. As she argues, women were denigrated in this way in the 16th and 17th centuries in order for their social power to be destroyed, their access to labor and resources to be stripped, their control over reproduction to be expropriated, and a campaign of terror to be unleashed in the form of the genocidal witch hunt launched to forcefully reinforce all this and serve the development of the nascent capitalist economy. And so the witch hunt itself, right, was an ideological justification for wresting control over reproduction from women, putting it at the service of capital's need for reproducing the labor force, and the needs of the ruling class to obliterate a major fount of peasant rebellion and heterodox resistance to those early capitalist developments. That is, women and women-controlled myriad non-commodified communal practices that had to be stamped out. And Federici makes an important parallel. She points out that the demonization of American indigenous peoples as hellish, subhuman devil worshippers also served to justify, we could say ideologically justify, their enslavement and expropriation of their resources by European colonial powers for purposes similarly of capital accumulation, ensuring the growth the system demands. And as she's at pains to underscore, that parallel is not an exaggeration. It underlines the importance of ideological justifications for and coupled with use of brute, repressive physical force, and I think that's something to consider. And so, by ideology, just so that we're clear, what I mean anyway, would be a system of beliefs, but also, importantly, largely unconscious assumptions, concepts, and frameworks for understanding the world, which can often, but don't always, reflect, protect, and help reproduce dominant social relations and dominating forms of social, or what you could call socioeconomic reproduction. The reproduction of the capitalist system, for example. And so there's an alternate perspective that I want to bring into the discussion, David Graeber's perspective in particular. And so he's articulated, again, he's done so elsewhere, but in his new book, The Utopia of Rules on Technology, Stupidity, and the Secret Joys of Bureaucracy, specifically in the essay in the book titled The Iron Law of Liberalism and the Era of Total Bureaucratization, he emphasizes something very different than what I've just done. That is, violence and the threat of violence as the primary mechanisms for social control. He even has a section in that essay that I just mentioned, which is titled, Do Not Underestimate the Importance of Sheer Physical Violence. And he has a quip in that section that goes something to the effect, anytime someone starts talking about the miraculous free market, look around for the man with the gun. He's never very far away. And that's very true. He goes on to write something that I want to read really quickly. He says that social theorists continue to insist that the direct appeal to force plays less and less of a factor in maintaining structures of social control. The more reports one reads, in fact, of university students being tasered for unauthorized library use, or English professors being jailed and charged with felonies after being caught jaywalking on campus, the louder the defiant insistence that the kinds of subtle symbolic power analyzed by English professors are what's really important. It begins to sound more and more like a desperate refusal to accept that the workings of power could really be so crude and simplistic as what daily evidence proves them to be. And Graeber is obviously right to foreground sheer physical violence. It permeates culture and is embedded in the given material conditions of capital, I'd argue, at the same time as its manifestations defend those violent material conditions. But there's almost always an ideological complement, and it's imperative to grapple with how ideology, as again a set of beliefs and the assumptions undergirding those beliefs, operates in different contexts, how it's functioning, what does it obscure and make less transparent, and what does it gloss over and omit, and what interests or whose interests does it serve, etc. And so, key points to consider. So, for example, even when, say, guns are more democratically distributed, the use of sheer physical force is more democratic, and ideas and people's attachments then still matter a lot. So, for example, anarchists in Spain managed to create a short-lived social revolution during the Spanish Civil War, which I believe Graeber's father actually fought in. And they had some guns, maybe not as many as they would have liked, and some inferior ones, but they also had a good deal of popular support, which was key. But so did fascists. And guns and brute force were not the only determining factor then there that enabled Franco to establish, ultimately, a fascist dictatorship after winning the Civil War. Similarly, it certainly seems that right-wing populists continue to capitalize on the really legitimate economic anxieties of working class and poor people who are subject to increasing conditions of precarity, not knowing if they're going to be able to make enough to feed their families, or knowing if they're going to even have a job, and when they have a job, it's awful, they can't find another one, and being rendered completely disposable under present-day capitalism. And the right-wing populist ideology redirects people's also legitimate anger and frustrations away from centers of power and away from critical examination of the system of socioeconomic relations that oppresses them, and toward hatred of vulnerable groups like immigrants, or in the U.S., especially with undercurrents of Islamophobia still rampant toward Muslim persons. Similarly, if to provide a little history lesson, the populist movement of the 1890s in the United States was undercut by white workers allied with poor blacks, and the former opted to tacitly forego the economic justice they were seeking for the relative racialized political privilege over people of color. So it's more than just a matter of people with guns here, I think. And a closer look at the history of the state-backed attempted extermination of indigenous persons in the Americas shows that sometimes there was a partial material basis for this ideology too, which is crucial. So, for example, following the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in California in 1848, which was also, of course, the year of continental revolutions across Europe, the year the Mexican-American War, U.S. War of Aggression, concluded, that was the same year that soon after gold was discovered, the California legislature passed a law that permitted white citizens to indenture Indians for an average of 16 years if they paid a fee of $2. And an estimated 10,000 or more Indians in California were indentured between 1850 and 1863. And the state of California received subsidies, in fact, in the form of reimbursement from the U.S. government for citizen squad killings of indigenous peoples. And predictably, many murders followed. To cite just one incident to make this concrete, when the Tolowa tribe gathered in the village of Yantucket in the fall of 1853 to pray around the world, so the river understood as the system center where heaven and earth converge, that's where citizens from California's Crescent City sacked the village, murdered men, women, and children, some 450 total. And so 1871, going forward a little bit, also the year many Parisian communards were slaughtered, enabling a would-be revolution, or ending a would-be revolution, that is. Another major incident in the genocide of American Indians took place. In Arizona, that same year, more than 100 Apache Indians were murdered at the intersection of the borderlands between Mexico and the U.S., Anglo-Americans, Mexican-Americans, and even some Papago Indians converged on Camp Grant and massacred the Apache, with those racial ethnic complexities, I think, illustrating how ideology can complicate matters, while also admittedly illustrating the attraction of exercising violence and extreme power over others, another key consideration. So that reminds me of the Frankfurt School's critique of fascism and World War, from earlier in the 20th century, and the Frankfurt School critical theorists had suggested there's a libidinal-like pleasure or some desublimated sexual gratification derived from violence, slaughter, subjugation, and gross exercise of authority over others. And you could maybe think of that as a sensuous component complementing certain ideologies. Now, ideologies say, are somewhat distinct and unacknowledged worldviews with slightly different but related presuppositions that can also complement each other. So ideology is plural is important to consider. So we'll go back to 1848 again. You had at work the doctrine, you could call it ideology of manifest destiny. And the doctrine assumed it was the destiny of the Anglo-dominated United States to dominate the continent and the world. And it helped justify U.S. aggression against Mexico in the Mexican-American War that concluded in 1848, with the U.S. yanking about half of Mexican territory. And that U.S. aggression was also ideologically justified, kind of weirdly, by rampant anti-Catholicism, which was partially likely the result of large influxes of predominantly Catholic Irish persons after the Irish potato famine in the mid-1840s. And then also it was propounded, for example, by Lyman Beecher, the weird father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who warned in a book he wrote in the 1830s about an impending papal plot. And, of course, Mexico was predominantly Catholic, so you had some ideological justification undergirding aggression there. And then Manifest Destiny also found another ideological complement in American exceptionalism. The notion present back as far as 1848 and before, that the United States nation-state is more exceptional than all other nation-states and peoples, and that arguably undergirded the genocidal attack on American Indians, of course, too, not without resistance, of course, which I hope Counterpower After Hour folks highlight throughout. I will just mention one indigenous revolt in the Americas, though not in the United States, that I think is worth noting. And it's weirdly kind of relevant because we just had a new moon this past January 9th, and back in 1804, which was also a leap year, like this year is, there were similar astronomical alignments, and that's also the year that Haiti gained independence from France. And it was one of the wholly successful slave revolts on such a large scale, and it's documented really well in C.L.R. James's famous book, The Black Jacobins. And as hip-hop artist Immortal Techniques pointed out, the black and Afro-Indigenous Haitians were perhaps the most astounding example of enslaved peoples instilling fear in the colonizer. And I'll let folks at Counterpower After Hours expound upon all that. That's all for this episode of Felix firing off from afar for the flyover. I'll be back at you next time.